Part 9. Caribou Highway. Canada in autumn paints the most vivid and gorgeous picture that I have seen anywhere in my travels round the world. One of my divining journeys took me up the road known as the Caribou Highway, although the caribou no longer live in those parts, since the coming of the white man. The highway leads to many flourishing ranches and big properties. A river with fairly deep banks cuts across it, and there I saw an unforgettable sight. Both banks, right down to the water's edge, were covered with thick little bushes which had turned a most glorious red and stretched for miles. Not only the bushes but the whole atmosphere seemed to be full of the same rich red, rising like a quivering haze to touch the beech trees, which nature had painted in all shades of color, from the palest yellow to the deepest orange. Above them, on the edge of the dark forest, were the maple trees decked out in their autumn dress, each layer of trees vying with the one below in its claim for the greater beauty. Earlier in the year the edges of the forests have great bushes of syringa, generally known as mock orange blossom, covered with pure white flowers which could be taken for piles of unmelted snow, but for the heavy scent which fills the air for a great distance. Canada is indeed a beautiful country. When I visited it again in 1953 I passed through the Rockies on my way from Vancouver to Saskatchewan. It was May and a great deal of the snow had melted, filling the rivers with that clear yellow-green water which comes from melted ice and snow. However, with one of nature's strange vagaries, winter had suddenly returned. 3 days before there had been a blizzard which had clothed the mountains with spotless white. This, with the rivers full of turbulent green water, made even the hardened travelers sit dumb and awed in the presence of such grandeur. In striking contrast to these huge mountains are the little bays and creeks around the coast. Some of them are beautiful with their blue water and the dark pines which grow everywhere in the huge province of British Columbia, and it was to one of these that I went when I had sufficiently recovered from my illness. It was a place to which the Red Indians used to take their sick, before the coming of the white man, as it was reputed to cure all ills. Since being in Canada I had acquired a theory that many of the wild animals could be attracted by music, so I had learnt to play a penny whistle, which sounded quite attractive out in the woods and carried a long way. It wasn't an original idea, as I remembered the boy in Greece playing to his goats and also the goat herds in Switzerland where they varied their music by yodeling to the sheep and goats when taking them over the snow-covered roads to drink. So, whenever I sat down to rest during my work I spent most of my time playing the whistle, and I proved that many woodland creatures were attracted by it, for they would come close to me both to investigate and listen. Chipmunks were particularly interested and would creep cautiously down the trees nearer and nearer, and I would often hear bigger animals moving about in the forest beyond. I was often warned that I would one day be faced by a snake. One bright sunny morning, when I was staying at this little bay, I was feeling the joy of being able to walk about again, so I took my whistle and wandered off. There was some talk of a cougar having been seen a couple of miles away, but I didn't take much notice of it as wild animals like the deep forest, and we were only on the fringe. I was particularly anxious to attract a species of big squirrel which was very shy, so I stood very quietly leaning against a big tree, playing and watching for it. I had nearly exhausted my repertoire when I heard something moving in the bushes behind me. I had had too much experience of big game to mistake the movements of a large animal for those of a human, and the report of the cougar flashed into my mind. There was a little open grassy glade in front of me with some low-growing trees on the other side. How I got across it I have no idea, nor how I shinned up the nearest tree. I never used to shine as a tree climber in my childhood, but I guarantee that only a monkey could have beaten me that day. I stayed in that tree for hours, for I could still hear something moving about in the bushes, but finally I had to climb down and run for it as it was getting dark. I must admit I was very thankful to get back to the house and the companionship of other human beings. The next day a cougar was seen by a forester quite near the little glade and shot. This cured me of playing the penny whistle when I was alone and near the forest. When I was appointed official water diviner to the government of British Columbia, I told the Minister of Finance about my divining tests on the oil fields at Signal Hill in California and asked him whether it would be possible to send me up north, as I understood that the government had been looking for oil there. The minister's reply was to pat me kindly on the shoulder and tell me that English people were all the same and had no idea of distances, which from the Canadian conception of distance is quite true, and that I should have plenty to do in finding water after a 7 years drought. I was therefore very surprised some months later to receive an order to proceed to Edmonton, the capital of the neighbouring province of Alberta, to meet the deputy minister and proceed with him to the Peace River block to look for oil. The Peace River block consisted of 3.5 million acres in the north of Alberta, which had been transferred to British Columbia by the Dominion of Canada. It contained some of the best wheat land in the world and, what thrilled me far more, was the home of the moose, caribou, bear, both black and grizzly, wolves, cougars and the pretty but unpleasant skunk. Some 10 years before, government geologists had marked out likely spots for oil which, in the interim, had become covered with scrub. 1 or 2 pilot holes, that is, small exploratory bores, had been put down and proved that the oil was there, but insufficient finance was available at the time to develop the project. British Columbia had been finding this Peace River block rather a white elephant, since the only outlet was the railway to Edmonton, and all the money poured into it by the government found its way into the coffers of Alberta. So it was with the idea of confirming the former oil locations of the geologists that I was sent up there. Once oil was found and developed, the block would become self-supporting. However, as this was to be kept top secret, it had to be camouflaged by my finding water for the settlers. At Edmonton I was joined by the deputy minister and 2 government officials, and we took the train to a little town called Pouce Coupe in the Peace River block, at the end of the railway. The last 10 miles of the railway were new, and we were warned that we would be well advised to sleep on the floor, as it was not altogether satisfactory. Our advisor did not exaggerate, and by the time we arrived at our destination I was black and blue. The journey resembled a very rough channel crossing, and very dusty and dirty as well. On arrival I asked the hotel manager if I could have a bath. There were sounds of suppressed laughter all round me. "My dear lady," he replied, "we couldn't give you a bath for all the gold in Canada. At present, if you have tea you can't wash, and if you wash you can't have tea." I heard a voice say, "Sometimes when I drink this tea I wonder." The manager ignored this and continued, "We are all hoping that you are going to find some water for us to have a bath ourselves." Nowhere was the need for water more desperate than at Pouce Coupe. Each morning, as a very special favor, I was brought a half-pint jug of hot water to wash in. The weather was broiling, with the dry burning heat of northern Canada. After 10 days of hard work, our little party of 3 decided that a bath was no longer just a luxury, but an urgent necessity. The question was how to get it. After many inquiries we found that we would have to motor 90 miles back into British Columbia to get one. We were warned that the roads would be bad and the dust suffocating for a great part of the journey. Nevertheless, the decision to go was unanimous. 180 miles was certainly a long journey for a bath, but I have never enjoyed one so much in my life. Before I left Victoria I had begged for a day off in the middle of every week, as no one, not even a strong man, should divine every day. Nobody could stand up to it, and I was beginning to feel the considerable strain. My request was not granted, and I was told that no one believed divining to be hard work. But fate was kind. The DM, who to all intents and purposes was my real boss, was here with me and had expressed a desire to see some divining done, which played into my hands beautifully. So I arranged with the local agriculturist, who had been receiving applications for my work and was taking me about, to go to one of the worst places he knew of, when we had the DM with us, which he did. He chose a burning hot day and the fields were nothing but red dust. Not a blade of grass was to be seen. At last we came to a poverty-stricken shack, although it was clean and tidy. The owner came to talk to us, and he had that worn look of hopelessness which one sees on the faces of people who have suffered from poverty and frustration for years with no hope of any let-up. He told me that he had one strong horse, which he drove every day with a small tank on a cart, to fetch water from an irrigation ditch 7 miles away. In cold or heat, all the animals which could do it had to walk the 7 miles to the ditch to drink. Did I think that I could find water any closer to hand? It seemed a pretty hopeless task, and all day I searched while I walked the DM off his feet. He was a big, strong man, but out of condition, and I would allow him no respite. I nearly collapsed myself, but I felt that it was in a good cause and that one day's intense fatigue was a small price to pay if it resulted in my getting a day off each week. The only water I was able to find near the shack was a little trickle in the ground 17 feet deep and which, at most, could not have given more than about 20 gallons an hour. So I had no alternative than to go back to the shack with the bad news. To my amazement, the man gasped, "What did you say, miss? 20 gallons a day or 20 gallons an hour?" To which I repeated that it was only a trickle, but that they should get 20 gallons an hour. He then shouted for Marie, his foreign wife who, when she heard the news, burst into tears and called down the blessings of all the saints on my head. To them it seemed too wonderful to be true, but to me it had seemed too little water to be worth digging for. As we left, Marie was sobbing on her husband's shoulder and the last thing we heard was, 20 gallons an hour. May the Blessed Virgin be thanked. I heard later that they got their water, so my grueling day in the heat was not altogether wasted, but the poor DM took to his bed and was not seen for the next 48 hours. Before returning to Victoria, the DM decided that he must go further north and look at the wheat crops. It was in the fall of the year and a time of great anxiety, for if a sharp frost comes just before the wheat is ripe enough to reap, which can easily happen in the northern wheat lands, the whole crop will be ruined. The head agriculturist had received a call for my work from some settlers living in the part of the country to which the DM was going, so he, the DM, another agriculturist and I set off early for a long day's traveling. About midday we arrived at the Peace River, to find a roaring mass of muddy water about a mile wide. A car ferry, worked by a half-caste Indian, was waiting to take us across. When he saw me, he asked the DM, whom he immediately recognized as the head of our party, why the white woman wore trousers. I always wore riding breeches and boots, as I never knew when I might have to ride a horse to reach my destination. The DM explained that I was there to find water for the settlers. At this, the ferryman, a huge fellow, got quite excited, if a red Indian can get excited, and asked the DM if I could go to his shack on the opposite bank of the river where, he said, there was no water, although there were 3 springs not far away which, he thought, might run under his land. He would show him the spot when we got across. Without thinking, I said, "Oh no, you won't. I will point them out from here." No sooner were the words out of my mouth than I realized that I must be crazy, for I had no idea whether I could work across open water and a mile of roaring torrent at that. However, it was too late to go back on it, so I made the attempt and, to my great relief, was able to point out the 3 springs. The ferryman ignored me, but said to the DM that one of the springs was a big one and he would show it to him when they got across. Having no idea that I was piling up trouble for us all, I called to him to come and stand behind me and I would show him which was the big one. This he did, most unwillingly, and grunted his confirmation of its correctness. We were then ferried across the river and, before continuing our journey, the DM promised that I would stop on the way back to see whether the water from any of the 3 springs was near his shack. The roads were the worst over which I had ever traveled. When we arrived at the farm where I was to work, we found 2 other families there, who begged me not to go without helping them too, for they were also in desperate need of water. Although they had not applied to the government for my services, it was impossible to refuse them, but it was all this extra work, which I found wherever I went, which was nearly killing me. All along the roads the people would wait for us and beg us to go to them. They would hang over gates and wave and cheer as we went by. I could have been there for months and still found people needing help. My time was all too short, but I had the satisfaction of knowing afterwards that I had given those lonely settlers in the north no less than 139 yielding wells to lessen their hardships. On our return journey, in spite of being completely exhausted, I went with the 3 men to look for water for the half-caste ferryman. When we arrived at the shack there was not a soul to be seen. Smoke was pouring out of a chimney, so I knew that there was someone about. But I wanted to get finished as quickly as possible, so I set to work to look for water straight away. Evidently the ferryman had told his family about my finding the 3 springs that morning and they were too scared to come near me. One of the great lumbering sons was watching me from behind a wood pile, and another from the shelter of a water butt, and the squaw was peeping through the crack of the door. I called out to the elder son to come close and then told him to tell his father that there was no water near the shack, but that he would get all that he wanted if he dug under a spruce tree, which I pointed out in the distance, of which I could only see the pale green tip. The boy took one look at where I was pointing, made several grunts and clicks with his tongue and fled. I then realized that I had again been very foolish, for in order to pinpoint anything at a distance it is necessary to have 3 converging lines. But I had only one line and the water might be anywhere along that line. However, I was so sure that water was under that particular tree, although I could only see its tip, that I didn't worry and said to the men, "For heaven's sake, hurry, and let's get off home." We made our way down the road to the car and passed close to the spruce tree, which the men marked with a little cairn of stones. The ferry was waiting for us when we reached the river. The ferryman immediately asked about the water at his shack. The DM stood by him and told him about the spruce tree and the cairn of stones while the other 2 men took me to the other end of the ferry. As the ferry touched the bank, they both cried jump, and rushed me up the bank while the car, driven by the DM, came tearing up from the ferry onto the road. One man tore open the door and fairly hurled me onto the back seat, while the other jumped in the front, and we shot down the road, even before the car doors were shut. When I had recovered sufficient breath, I burst out, "What in the world do you men think you're doing, throwing me about like that?" To which the DM replied, "You ought to be damn thankful you were thrown into the car and not into the river." He went on to explain that the spruce tree, which I had indicated, used to have a sacred spring beneath it, but it was considered too close to the road to be safe and the engineers had poured cement over it until it disappeared. For the white woman to have found the spring from half a mile away, when she could barely see the top of the spruce, was to the ferryman pure magic, and he kept telling the DM that I should be thrown into the river and drowned as a witch. If I had not had 3 white men with me, I certainly would have been. The matter-of-fact DM, who was driving, called to me over his shoulder, "I don't think that you have ever been nearer death than you were this morning." I am beginning to think that divining is not only a very tiring profession, but a very dangerous one as well. The last work I did in the Peace River was very far north. By this time I think the DM felt something akin to an old-fashioned organ grinder with a pet monkey. He and his exhibit were greeted with so much enthusiasm and delight wherever they went, the need of water being so desperate, that he kept forgetting that the poor little monkey wasn't just a machine to be wound up when it ran down, and went on promising more and more people that they would have water, and that I would find it for them. At the end of one of the most grueling days I have ever experienced, I crawled into the back of the car and went fast asleep, only to be wakened and told that there was one more place I must go to. It was 20 miles away, and as I should never be there again, it had just got to be done. I tried to argue, but I was too tired and went to sleep again. In some places the roads were just tracks, and it was incredible that anyone could sleep when bumping over them. Yet it is extraordinary what physical exhaustion will do. When we arrived and I was finally awake, I found we were at Fort St. John, a small, lonely settlement with a gravelled square in the middle of it and a very new little Roman Catholic church at one end. There was one big underground stream and another crossing it, but as it was just under the corner of the Roman Catholic church, it couldn't be used. I was told I must find another. Now normally I lose my temper perhaps once in 10 years. I was suddenly absolutely furious. It swept over me like a sheet of flame and was probably caused by my terrible exhaustion. Anyway, I walked to the middle of the square and said, "There is enough water here to float a battleship, but it is horrible water. I have a smell like rotten eggs in my nose and a filthy taste in my mouth, so you can't have it anyway," and I started to walk back to the car. The DM and the inhabitants all shouted to me to come back, and the former kept saying that I hadn't done any work on the spot, so how could I know if the water was good or bad? But I did know, and I wouldn't listen to them, and I just sat in the car and cried, and I didn't care if the whole world saw me, which was odd, as I generally find it is as hard to cry as a lot of people I meet find it hard to laugh. Then the priest from the little church told the DM that years before a well had been dug very near to the place I had shown them, but the water was so full of sulfur that it was useless and the well had been filled in again. This was the first time that I had discovered that I could tell whether the water was good or bad by the smell in my nose and the taste in my mouth. I still do this and find it most useful. End of part 9.